Okay, so let's dive into Leviticus 15. Now I know, this is one of those chapters that can feel a little strange, a little confusing. It's all about bodily discharges and something called ritual purity. But what if I told you these ancient laws are not really about hygiene? What if they're about a deep, profound respect for the sacred? Well, that's what we're going to find out. We are going to walk through this verse by verse and uncover the incredible logic behind this whole system. Let's get started. So here's our roadmap for the journey. We'll start with the laws for men, and we're going to trace how this idea of ritual uncleanness spreads from a person to the things around them. Then we'll look at the exact steps to get back to a state of purity. We'll see how these same ideas apply to women, and then at the very end, we'll pull it all together to understand the real sacred purpose behind every single one of these rules. All right, let's start at the very beginning, at the source. This chapter kicks off by establishing a foundational idea that certain completely natural bodily functions create a temporary state of, well, what the text calls ritual uncleanness. Now, before we go a single step further, we have to lock in this definition. It is so important. The word unclean here does not mean dirty or sinful. It's not about hygiene. Think of it more like a spiritual timeout. It's a temporary state where you're just not ready to be near the holy presence of God's dwelling place. That's it. Okay, verse 1, it just sets the stage. God is speaking to Moses and Aaron. Then verse 2 lays down the core rule. Any man with an abnormal bodily discharge is considered ritually unclean. You can almost picture an invisible barrier popping up around him, setting him apart for a time. But then verse 3 adds this really fascinating twist. This state applies whether the discharge is flowing freely or if it's blocked up. You know, think of it like a pipe. It's considered faulty whether it's leaking all over the place or it's completely clogged. Either way, it's not working right. So this state of uncleanness isn't just contained to one person. Nope, it's transferable. The best way to picture it is like a ripple in a pond, spreading outward from a single touch and affecting everything it comes into contact with. Let's follow that ripple. Verse 4 tells us where it starts. Any bed the man lies on or any chair he sits on also becomes unclean. I mean, just imagine a dark, shadowy stain spreading across the sheets the moment he gets up. Then, verse 5, if someone else comes along and just touches that bed, that shadow kind of leaps onto them, marking their clothes. And verse 6 makes it clear. The exact same thing happens with his chair. Just sitting where he sat is enough to transmit that ritual impurity. And the ripple just keeps getting wider. Verse 7 is about direct contact. Picture someone putting a hand on the unclean man's shoulder. Boom, that state is instantly transferred. Then verse 8 shows us that even indirect contact is enough. I mean, if the man spits and it happens to land on someone else, that's all it takes to transfer the uncleanness. That second person now has to go and wash. The ripple keeps expanding. Verse 9 extends the rule to the saddle on his horse. Verse 10 shows that if he sits on a cloak, for instance, that cloak now becomes a carrier of the impurity. And then verse 11 gives us this really key detail about personal responsibility. If the unclean man touches someone without rinsing his own hands first, he passes on his impurity. It's a clear signal to be mindful of your state and how it can affect others. Verse 12 gives us this powerful physical picture of how these laws work. An object's very material decides its fate. So a porous clay pot that he touches, it has to be shattered. It's as if the impurity has soaked in and just can't be removed. But a non-porous wooden bowl, that can be rinsed clean with water and used again. It's such a clear visual distinction between what can be restored and what's considered permanently affected. Okay, so if that's how this whole uncleanness thing happens and spreads, how do you get back to a state of purity? Well, the text doesn't leave you hanging. It lays out a very clear, step-by-step process for that journey back into the community. This path back is a really clear three-part journey. First up, verse 13, waiting and washing. Once his discharge stops, he has to count 7 full days. Then he washes himself and his clothes in what the text calls living water. That means fresh, running water, like from a stream. It's this beautiful symbol of completely rinsing away the old state. Second, verse 14 is the offering. On the 8th day, he brings 2 birds to the priest. And finally, step 3, verse 15, is atonement. The priest performs the sacrifice, which finalizes his restoration, and he's officially declared ritually clean again. Okay, so now the chapter pivots a little bit. We're going to see these very same principles, these same ideas applied to women. And it starts with a few cases that actually involve both men and women together. So the focus shifts to other kinds of discharges. Verse 16 deals with a man's emission of semen. This results in a much shorter, temporary uncleanness that only lasts until evening. Verse 17 is the logical next step. Any clothing or leather it touches also has to be washed. And then verse 18 addresses intimacy between a man and a woman. Afterwards, both of them have to bathe, and they're both considered unclean until evening. It's a shared state of ritual separation. And now we turn to the laws for a woman's regular menstrual cycle. Verse 19 sets up a 7-day period of ritual separation, and you'll see the pattern here. It mirrors the earlier laws for the man perfectly. Verse 20 says her bed and any furniture she sits on also become unclean. And that ripple effect continues right into verse 21. Anyone who touches her bed then has to wash their own clothes and is considered unclean until evening. It's amazing how consistent the principles are.
The parallels just keep going. Verse 22 applies the rule to her chair. Verse 23 adds another fascinating layer. Even touching something that's just sitting on her bed or chair is enough to transfer the uncleanness. And verse 24 lays out a very specific consequence. If a man is intimate with her during this time, he becomes unclean for a full 7 days, and that uncleanness then spreads to any bed that he lies on.
So the law also makes space for situations that are irregular or go on for a long time, and it outlines a specific path back to purity for these cases too.
So verse 25 says that for any kind of prolonged or irregular bleeding, her state of uncleanness lasts for as long as the discharge itself continues. Verse 26 confirms that during this whole period, all those same rules of transfer apply to her bed and her furniture. And verse 27 just really hammers it home, anyone who touches those things also becomes unclean and has to wash up. And what's really beautiful here is that the woman's path back to purity follows that same familiar 3-step process. It's almost identical to the man's. Verse 28, once the discharge stops, she waits and counts 7 clean days. Verse 29, on the 8th day, she brings the exact same offering of 2 birds. And verse 30, the priest makes atonement for her, and her restoration to ritual purity is officially complete. Okay, so after walking through all of those specific case-by-case scenarios, the chapter gives us this powerful conclusion that explains the ultimate why. Why did any of this matter? What was the whole point of this intricate system? And here it is. Verse 31 gives us the master key to the whole chapter. This was never about shaming people or punishing them for being human. It was all about protecting the sanctity of God's dwelling place, the tabernacle, which was right there in the middle of their camp. These laws created this necessary, respectful boundary, a kind of buffer zone between the ordinary physical world of humanity and the awesome holiness of the sacred. The final 2 verses, 32 and 33, basically act like the closing credits. They're a final summary, just making sure every single category has been covered. The law applies to a man with an abnormal discharge, a man with an emission, a woman during her regular period, and anyone, man or woman, with an irregular discharge. It leaves absolutely no room for doubt, giving the whole community a complete framework to work with. So when you really boil it all down, the big takeaway from Leviticus 15 isn't about being disgusted by the human body. It's about structure. It was a practical, physical system for managing that intersection between everyday, messy, beautiful human life and the awe-inspiring, pure presence of the sacred. And that leaves us with a final question for you to think about. While these specific purity laws might feel ancient and distant, that core idea of creating boundaries to protect what we decide is sacred is still very much alive today. I mean, think about it. From the velvet ropes at a museum to the enforced quiet of a library or the dedicated space of a sanctuary, how do we, in our own lives and societies, still draw lines to separate the sacred from the everyday?